they're looking to get either some kind of services or advice, right? JOS is what we talked about: judgments, opinions, services, skill, or advice. If anything, conversation is leading towards something of that nature, we need to put a pause in the process and send them out the Reco information. Conversation or an activity is requested. And when I say activity, it might be, I want to go see a property, right? So they may call you up and just be like, hey, I want to go see this. Might not even start much of a conversation, in which case you have to initiate that first pause. And that first pause is going to be this Reco information guide. Okay. And there's a few requirements that need to be fulfilled in order to complete that Reco information guide process, right? And we have talked about this. We talked about it last week. And first things first, I mean, the guide needs to be sent to them, right? Okay, so the guide must be sent to the consumer. And as we've talked about, it cannot be personalized or altered. So it needs to be sent as is from the Reco website. Okay. Secondary is that secondly, what is that a word? Secondly, I don't think so, but my brain's going a little loop. So, like all of us are. Anyways, the contents of the guide must be explained, right? And understood by the consumer. I almost said the other bad word. By the consumer, okay? Then third activity in that process is that the consumer needs to acknowledge that they've read, understood it, and has been explained to them. Okay, so those three things: sent it, explained, and stand. Okay, so does that mean we can just download the guide, load it up in DigiSign, send it to the consumer, and have them sign it? You guys think? Full of answers. Let's see if we can get just a couple here. No, that's right. If you do that, then you're not proving that you've explained it, right? And that's part of the process. So we want to make sure that we share the guide first, go through the process of explaining it, right? Then you could maybe, if you're going to take the signing route of it, we're going to talk about a few ways in which this can be achieved. I want to then now have it signed and acknowledged. Okay, so just firing it off through DigiSign or whatever platform you're using is not gonna fulfill that obligation. Okay. All right, so first process we'll talk about, which is the one that we were all kind of expecting that would be the only way, but there are two ways, okay? And that's going to be what I'm designating as kind of the manual procedure. In case we're going to download the guide, or we're going to print it out and bring it to our consumers, potential clients, right? Anytime I say consumer, it's also going to mean kind of prospective client. Or not, we'll see, wherever that path leads, right? You got to download the information guide and email it to the customer or deliver it to them, whatever it would be. Okay. Then we're going to take the necessary steps to explain the guide. Then at the very last bit of the guide, there's also the signature aspect, right? We got to fill out some information: real estate agent name, brokerage name, and then there's an acknowledgement that it's been explained to them, obviously shared with them, because you can't acknowledge without that aspect, but that has been shared, explained, they understand everything. Okay, so at that point they would sign here, and then you'd be completed with that. Okay, and you have to maintain obviously your own records of all this stuff, so you'd want to have a system in which you're keep records. In case something comes up, you're going to want to prove that this process was taken care of. Okay, that would be the manual way. Reco, I think it was Friday, kind of dumped upon us. I mean, I didn't know it was coming. I don't know if others did, but there is a Reco online tool now. Great. I really love this. I think it's a little bit better in my opinion, my personal way. I mean, it's all going to depend on every client. how you're going to do your process. But in the end, I like this one. So this is recoinfoguide.ca. I saved the link, so I'm going to pop it in the chat here, right? Going to be one of your bookmarks, that is for sure, right? Okay, so Reco Info Guide. What's going to happen here? Okay, so you're going to come to the page on share the Reco information guide, and then you're going to be taken to what you see here up on the slide. Fill out some of the information here, which is just going to be your information. Brokerage email is optional. Then you are going to add in the consumer's name and their email. Okay, you'll see just below that you can add another consumer. So now you can send this to multiple people in one fell swoop. All right, and I had a lot of questions over the weekend about this, so we're going to get into the details of how this plays through the whole procedure so that you're very confident and aware of when you know that you're finalized your obligation guide. Okay. So I've taken up I went through the whole process, and I've taken up a fake consumer here who goes by the name of Crispy Bacon. Okay. So I filled out Crispy Bacon's information. All right. And I sent the email. Okay. So I sent out the email, and I received email from Reco stating that Crispy Bacon by the email, which I knocked out. That was my own personal email. Okay. So Crispy Bacon here has received information guide. So great. We've done the first part. And I had a lot of people wonder, well, how do I know that they've read it and all that kind of stuff, right? Okay. So we're going to get to that. So the first step is you're going to get that first email, okay, that they've received it, which is great. We know it's been sent now. Okay. So what does the consumer see? Okay, so this is going to be the first email that they get. Okay, the consumer receives an email with a link to the guide. The other important thing to note is that this expires within 7 days. Okay, so the link itself in the email will expire after 7 days. Then it reads as follows. Below you'll find a link to the Reco information guide shared by myself, and then it gives the link to the guide. Okay, if you have any questions about the content of the guide, you'll have an opportunity to notify the real estate agent contact you. Has anyone used this tool yet? All right, good. I love to see it. I love to see it. All right, so people are already on top of this. Good. Okay, so they get the link to the guide, at which point they're going to receive the guide, okay? And this is where a lot of the questions over the weekend came up for me, okay? Jane had plenty too. And what's going to happen at this point is they're going to have the online guide, which they can scroll through and read. Okay. And you're, of course, going to explain it to them. You're going to fulfill that second aspect. Ask them if they have any questions, anything like that. End of the online guide is presented with two main options. Okay. Just these two check boxes. Deal with the third, but the first two are the main ones. Okay. So the first checkbox, I have received the guide and the real estate agent explained the content to me. Okay. Second one, they have received the guide. It was explained to them. They still have further questions. Now, I was pretty sure when I did this multiple times, I'm going to get the exact same email back, essentially. And this is the email that you want to complete the loop. Okay, there is a third option, or not an option, sorry. One of the first two have to be done. Okay, there is a third checkbox, which is not a requirement, but the consumer can also choose to allow Reco to contact them in the future. Bacon might get a little connect with Reco. Okay, so they may choose that, they may not. Bottom line, they have to choose one of the two, and then they click on the I acknowledge button. All right. Then, so what's going to happen, and this is the important one. So you got that first email where you shared it. And then this is going to be the most important one to know that you've finalized the process. Get an acknowledgement email, one that comes to you as the agent. Okay. Bacon acknowledgement. This email confirms that Crispy Bacon at whatever email has acknowledged they received the Reco information guide and that you explain the content to them, right? That's what we want. We want to know that they've acknowledged and that you've explained it to them. Important, please keep a copy of this email for your records. Thank you. Okay. Very important things to keep in mind about this whole online tool process is going to be that that link expires within 7 days. Okay, when I went through this process online, I did the whole process. I went back to the original client or consumer email, sorry. I clicked on the link and nothing happened because they've already gone through the whole process and no longer kind of revisit it. Okay, so that's just important to keep in mind. The other thing is that Reco does not store the confirmation email. So it's important that, we need to have these confirmation emails for a long time, forever, right? Just in case an issue arises, we want to be able to prove that we fulfilled the obligations under the Reco information guide. Okay. And I mean, I came up with a quick and easy one. You your own system, but I feel that, one of the easiest ways is that in your email, you're going to create a folder, maybe called Reco confirmations or something like that. And you're going to place every single email, whether it's the initial one plus the acknowledgement, in that folder. And then you're always going to you're not going to accidentally delete them or whatever. They're going to be in that separate folder so that you can have them for future storage. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. And the other thing too is that these acknowledgments are going to be needed. They're going to be have to be in SkySlope. So if you choose the first route, you're going to upload the signed page. Okay, the signed acknowledgement page. If you're going to go with the Reco online tool, you can always just print that email. You print to PDF. So instead of choosing print to your computer, you're going to print to PDF. Now you're going to have a downloaded PDF of that acknowledgement email, and then you're going to upload that to SkySlope. Boom, you're done. We went through it, took a bunch of time, but that's going to be that's the first pause in the process, is going through and delivering that Reco information. Said we'll do questions later, but everyone, that makes sense? All right, cool. Good. All right, so next thing is going to be the information and disclosure to self-represented party forms. Okay, so this is only going to be if the consumer has sort of announced that they are going to be a self-represented party, right? Not everyone's an SRP. Okay, they're consumers until they've decided that they want to proceed one way or the other. They may beginning choose to be still a consumer. They may have not decided. Okay, so even then you can still share public factual information like we've talked about, right? You only necessarily need to pause when that JASA comes into effect, or they want to choose to do it. Okay, but let's at this point, we're going to pretend, okay, this person has announced that they want to be a self-represented party. Well, what do we got to do now? Okay, so Reco has another requirement that needs filled in order to continue forward with that individual providing assistance, right? So if the consumer has chosen to be self-represented, then Reco requires us to complete the SRP disclosure form before any assistance is provided. And again, you can oh wait, first and foremost, sorry. So the designated representation version is what we need to provide because we are a designated we were under, or EXP is under the designated representation model. Okay, so that's going to be the one that you're going to want to provide, and you're going to see in the top right hand corner, designated representation version. One thing I didn't quite mention, but you'll notice on that recoinfoguide.ca website, very bottom, there are links to the forms. Top aspect is dealing with you sending it electronically. At the very bottom of it, on the forms and get them. Okay. All right. So that form look like? So you can, again, you can send it through the Reco online tool as well. Okay, but this form is to be fully completed and should be signed by the SRP before assistance is provided to them. Okay, and we'll dive into it a little bit later. Remember, you can only assist an SRP if you already have a client in the trade, right? Because it's to the benefit of your client providing that assistance. Okay, we dove into that quite deeply in our other sessions, so that's about all we'll talk about that today, I think. Okay. All right, so if the SRP refuses to sign, caution, be very careful. You may not want to provide any assistance, right? And these forms are not in, sorry, I saw that pop up, but these are not in web forms. All these forms are on the Reco website because this is something that Reco is governing. Okay, so these, at least at this point, I don't expect they'll ever be in web forms, because this is something that needs to be sent from the Reco website, especially if you're doing the online tool route, or download them from the Reco website. Okay. But if they refuse to sign, proceed with caution, and at the very least notate that it was provided, the SRP refused. A lot of this image up here is what it looks like when you download the form. See that it asks for your Reco registration number and things like that on the form. Okay. You'll present this to them, explain it, same sort of scenario for the guide, explaining, then they will do their acknowledgement. These are all consent and acknowledgement forms. They are not agreements. Can't have an agreement, RP. These are all consent and acknowledgement forms in order for us to be able to proceed, right? Now, if you choose to go the route of using the online tool, pretty much the same information. The online tool is not asking for your Reco identificate or Reco registrant number, but is pretty much asking for similar information. In which case you're gonna send that off, and it's gonna be the same as the guide. You're gonna get that acknowledgement email. I'll go to the next slide because I don't think I put all that stuff up there. There was no point in sort of reposting that, but it's going to be that same process. You're going to get, yes, you shared the SRP disclosure form, and you're going to get to the point where they're going to read through it, okay, and then they're going to acknowledge. You're going to get that acknowledgement email, right, which is the one that you want, and you want, like we talked about, you're going to want to keep that. Okay, so you're going to want to hold on to that, put it in, maybe now you have a separate folder, Reco SRP confirmations. Okay, so you could put it all in the same one, because remember with your email too, you can just go at the very top search bar, you know the name of the person, so you just type in the name and boom, that email is going to pop up for you. So you don't necessarily have to sift through confirmation folder. It's just a place where you're going to put everything so you don't accidentally delete it, and then when you use your search feature in your email, boom, it's going to pop up with all the emails you ever sent that person. Okay, very easy way to navigate and locate those emails. So once they've acknowledged it, then you're good. irrespective of the Reco obligations. Okay, so Reco info guide chosen to be an SRP, then we have to deal with the Reco SRP form. Okay. Now, in addition to that, all right, we've got the AREA Form 311, which is a buyer self-represented party acknowledgement and consent form. Not necessarily a requirement, but I would highly suggest also take care of. Why? Because it covers many additional aspects that aren't covered in the Reco disclosure form. Okay, such as if an SRP is now involved in the transaction, we need their consent to some extent. Well, we do need their consent to post the sale price to MLS, right? Giving agents the ability to use that information for comparable data. So that's going to be a little bit bizarre. I'm not going to go into it if they don't. What's that going to look like for a listing on MLS that is sold? I don't know at this point. We'll talk about something like that in the future. But for now, it covers some of these extra things. It also covers that the buyer is not party, or the SRP, not a party to a representation agreement with any other brokerage. Okay. Then it has a lot of good chunk of pre-printed clause like we have in many of the other agreements. So again, just like every other form, through these and just get a good idea of what's okay. Form 311. And you'll see that you've got your brokerage and buyer information up at the top. Property that you're providing assistance for, right? We can only provide assistance, have a client already in the trade. You're going to want to notate what that property is, right? Who we're providing assistance for, what exactly. Okay, so this is very important information as well, not things that we're going to want to leave blank. Okay, and the buyer here is also going to initial in that next section. They're not party to another agreement as well. Okay, that's something we would want to get acknowledgement for, right? Okay. Got declaration of insurance, printed name and signature, which is on the next page. I don't know why I put that arrow there, but hey, it happens. But we've got initials at the bottom, okay? So there we go. I have the declaration. This is the second page. It's a 2-pager, this thing. Actually, I think it's 3 pages, sorry. All right, so you have the ability to add in schedules if you feel that you want to add in any kind of schedules, right? Describing may be going on with the transaction, all right? Get the signature of the buyer, okay? Declaration of insurance, printed name and signature, and then the acknowledgement that they received a copy, right? So a lot of these aspects are similar to forms we've always had, right? So yes, it's a new form. Yes, it covers new things, but there's still a lot of familiarity here. Forms, okay? There's also a seller self-represented party acknowledgement and consent form. And I didn't throw it up here because it's pretty much the exact same thing. Pretty much same sort of features to that, other than one aspect that there is a extra initial bubble where it gives you, if they agree to it, the ability to put up a sold sign on the property. So that's definitely an interesting one, right? So we've got basically the same thing with the seller self-represented party form. Okay, so very important to put something like this because you may want to, promote that you've sold this property. So they could initial there and you could plunk a sign up. An SRP's lawn. Interesting. Anyways. So once those are all taken care of, still want to do a working with a realtor with the SRP. Okay, so we've got the guide, got the Reco SRP document. Got the RIA SRP document. Now we're on to the working with a realtor. See, barely hardly any extra paperwork. Wink, wink. All right, so now we've got the working with a realtor, right? So on this form, you'll notice, as you've seen, if you've seen it already, we've got the section in the top right-hand corner. Okay, obtain initials for an SRP acknowledging that they've received explained acknowledgement form. Okay, and also the guide as well. Okay, so we've got two aspects here that we want to complete. They have acknowledged again that they've received and explained the information guide. Right, this is important because yes, I know we're re-acknowledging, but they're declaring themselves as one or the other, whether they want to be represented or whether they are going to be an SRP. In our current situation, SRP, right, self-represented party, in which case we want to complete this form as well. Okay, then as per somewhat usual, right, at the bottom we've got to initial one or the other, right? And of course, with an SRP scenario, where is the bottom section, right? I only highlighted the buyer side, but it could be the same if it was on the seller's side, right? Is not representing my interest to be documented in a separate self-represented party acknowledgement. Realtor will act in fair, ethical, and professional manner, right? I didn't put a box there, but as you can see, as per usual that we've always done, you're going to put the acknowledgement by, and then you're going to put, right? That's nothing new. Name of the brokerage, nothing new. That's the same, right? Signatures, nothing new. The fact that they have to initial, nothing new. It's just that we've got, instead of, I'm not going to say the old bad word, but instead of the bottom one being something else, now we're dealing with SRPs in this section, right? That's what it is. Could use the form 812, but the 812, so if anyone ever knew, was because many might not have, is that there used to be a brochure, right? There used to be like I think it was 4 pages. So a 4-page working with a realtor brochure. That's what the 812 is now. It's a 2-pager. So pretty much everyone only ever uses the 810, and that's how you're probably going to continue anyways, right? Remember when ARIA started sort of announcing all these forms, they're bringing back ones that we kind of maybe never used anyways to begin with, but they're coming back into the scenario. So the 812 is that sort of brochure. They've chunked it down to 2 pages, but the 810 is going to do the job. You're fine to use either one, but the 810 is going to do the trick, just it always has for you. Okay. All right, so once we've got the working with a realtor completed, let's look at where we're now, okay? One of two pathways. Important to remember, as I've already mentioned a few times, only provide assistance to an SRP if we already have a client in the trade. For example, your seller client's listing, buyer, the tenant declares themselves as an SRP, maybe wants to look at the property or talk about the property, something, okay? Extends the talking part, extending beyond public factual information, right? Okay, so if the consumer refuses to sign any of the above mentioned documents, caution if you want to proceed at all, right? I mean, at the very least, notate the documents were provided and the consumer refused to sign. Okay, ensure you've sent the documents via a trackable source. Really why I like the online tool. Load up the PDF in an email and send it to them. Surely, you surely can do that. Tool does that as well by just filling out the information. Chosen to be an SRP, as we've talked about, you can provide assistance, right? So option two. So we're rolling back. We're rolling back. A consumer has come to your listing, okay, and they wish to engage the services as in representation. Okay, so if we're done with the SRP side of things, rolling back to our scenario, and someone now wants to be represented, okay? We have to ask ourselves a very crucial question here. Transaction in question, your listing, or do you already have a buyer client interested in the same property? Right? Because now we're rolling into multiple representation scenario, which is again another important aspect of TRESA, right? And so multiple representation under the designated representation model. Point, I want to be clear that we're ignoring the fact we're going under the assumption, sorry, that all listings, all representation documents are under the new model. Okay, right? There's going to be some overlap with pre-TRESA documents. Again, if you have a scenario you're not really sure about, please come talk to one of us. Happy to help you with that. Understanding what kind of scenario you might be involved in, but we're going to take this approach that all documents are under the new model. Okay, so being that everything's under the new model, multiple representation is going to occur in one of two instances. That you have maybe two buyers wanting to go after the same property, or you're going to be potentially representing both buyer and both seller, right? So is the transaction in question your listing, or do you have two buyers? The answer is no. Then now you can just proceed to complete. You're working with a realtor buyer's representation agreement. Boom, they become your client and you do what you have always done, right? So that's fairly straightforward, I think. The answer is yes. Now we must deal with the multiple representation scenario. So yes, as in you're now heading in the direction representing both buyer and seller in the same transaction, or you have two buyers going after the same property. Deal with multiple representation as both the seller and buyer need to consent, right? Before we can proceed. It's going to be very important. This is another pause in the process, right? Before we used to kind of just have things filled with the offer process, but that's now going to change. Okay. Two forms that we're talking about with multiple representation. Both would have to be completed. Change depending on whether it's the two buyer scenario or the buyer and the seller. But again, about that, come talk to us, because today we're going to talk about buyer and seller because that's going to be the most common scenario. Okay, so that's what I'm focusing on today. All right, so you're going to have two forms which are separate documents, which are the multiple representation, seller acknowledgement, and consent disclosure. One, the seller is going to have to sign if they can. Remember, this is if they can both consent being both the buyer and seller agree to multiple representation. These documents should be a separate signing. I want to be very clear with that. Reco has explicitly expressed that this is a separate conversation which parties have to agree to. So, I mean, let's pretend now you got a buyer who just, you've got a listing. Buyer calls you up, 10 for a second. They're just want to move right away on the property. They know they want it. They want you to represent them. Boom. Well, now you've got maybe an offer happening within, half an hour. Reco says, well, you know what? This conversation needs to be had before you further. So can you send the multiple representation documents with the offer? You guys think? No. Love it. because it needs to be a separate conversation, you should have a separate signing where you're signing these multiple representation documents, right? That all completed. Then if everyone agrees to it, now you can proceed to the next step of doing the offer. So again, pause in the process. Multiple representation is one of those pauses, and definitely a big one. Okay, so good that this will be the way that now if you're doing the offer 10 minutes after that, that's fine. That's not a big deal. You have a separate signing that proves that this conversation was dealt with, everyone agreed to it. Now proceed to the next step. Okay. All right. So dealing with multiple representation. Okay, so these are the forms. And I'm just going to take a sip of water here, guys. Sorry. Buyer and the seller is essentially the same. Okay, so I've only put up the seller one here for now. And it's going to be start off very similar as to many of our forms, right? The seller or the buyer, depending on which form it is. Brokerage and the property that's in question. Okay, and then there's four bubbles here. All right, and we are going to have some overlap over the next little while. Again, if you have a scenario that you're not really sure about, please come talk to us. Have listings that fall under brokerage right now because of pre-trusted documents. Going to have some new documents, new agreements, right, that are now going to be under the designated representation model. So there is going to be, okay, but first section is going to be both listing and buyer representation documents are pre-TRESA. So if you have a listing that you signed up before December 1st, and you have a buyer that you signed up before December 1st, those are going to be brokerage clients, right? Section that you deal with for that. Okay. Next is going to be, ooh, I did a boo-boo on this, so I apologize already. I made my box a little bit too big. Most common is going to be that third one. Okay, multiple representation and designated representation, where both listing and buyer documents have a designated representative. All right. Well, I did put here, maybe not. Only one bubble should be initialed because, yeah, you might have limited service, but we are a full service brokerage, so we're not really gonna. We hopefully can steer away from using limited service if we have to. Okay. But once all the documents are in the new way, right, designated representation model, then we're going to be dealing with the multiple representation and designated representation section pretty much most of the time. Okay. There's the very bottom one, which is multiple representation and designated representation and brokerage representation. Now, this is going to be when documents, let's say, are pre-TRESA and the buyer representation documents have a designated representative. So this is, again, what I'm talking about. I'm really trying not to confuse people. So please reach out to us if you have a scenario in which you're not sure, because this will be another one where if you have an overlap, because as we talked about last week, that all the documents pre-TRESA either are good and valid up until March 30th, unless they are amended or they have expired. Otherwise, all agreements will be on the new documents. I won't delve into that too much further. Again, there's a bubble for initials, consent for multiple representation, and then at the bottom, we're going to have initials and signatures consenting to multiple. Okay, so form that you would, this is part of that conversation, whether they consent to multiple consented, then this is where we're going to head. We're going to fill out this one, and we're also going to fill out 326. All right. So we're at the point where we've dealt multiple representation. We have, right? So have both buyers and sellers consented to multiple representation? That's our question. It's our main question. We've come across a situation where it's arising. We want to find out whether or not people have consented to it. And if they have, by signing the right documents, okay, we'll get into that, but let's deal with the easiest one first. No, let's say no, one of the parties is not acceptable of multiple representation. If the answer is no, then you have pretty much two choices. The agent must release one of the clients, signed a representation with the buyer, okay, already before going into this scenario. You're gonna have to release, or you're gonna have to refer that buyer or seller, right? It's gonna be the buyer more than likely, right? To another EXP designated representative or non-EXP. Okay, so typically, if you know that multiple representation is going to arise, more than likely you're not going to sign anything with the buyer yet. You're going to find out whether multiple representation is going to be consented to. So you're going to proceed. Not, you're going to refer that person out to someone else. Okay. If everyone does consent, sign the appropriate documents, the 325, the 326. Right, then you're going to proceed with your representation documents for the buyer, and you're going to proceed as in the scope that multiple representation allows. Okay. Then at this point, you're pretty much going to continue on with your transaction like you always have. Right, so not a whole lot. We're not dealing with some of the other forms right now. We're just talking about most common scenarios. Right, so you're just going to pretty much continue like you always have. So the hump here is getting to these points. Once the transaction is getting to that point of writing up offers and whatnot, it's going to be very similar to what you've done so far. Okay. Then now we're proceeding. Now part of the offer process, as you know, you're going to have the confirmation of cooperation and representation. It's a real funky document right now, so we're not going to dive into some theory craft, because there's some statements on this thing that is a little out of whack. So again, if you have a unique scenario, I can't stress enough, please come talk to your managing broker. We'll assist you with your scenario to help you understand which check boxes to use if you're not sure. Okay, but we're going to deal with most common. Remember, most common scenarios are going to be that there's a listing brokerage and a co-op brokerage. So a whole lot, going to necessarily change conf of co-op. It's only when the multiple representation and or maybe some of the FSBO scenarios, things like that, there's going to be some adjustment, right? Definitely going to be some adjustment in those scenarios, but for today, deal with some of the more common ones, and we'll touch upon some of the other aspects as well. Okay, so again, you're going to have listing brokerage and co-op brokerage, right? We're rolling back. We're forgetting what we talked about, that multiple rep, because now we're starting from, let's pretend it's just a listing and co-op brokerage, right? Which is kind of a new deal we're talking about. So in that case, you're going to deal with your typical 1A and 1A1 checkboxes. And so the listing brokerage representing the interest of the seller, and the listing brokerage is not representing the buyer. Boom, right? Okay, that's your most common scenarios. Not a whole lot is changing here. Now, if there's an SRP involved, then we've got to check 1A, and then we're going to also check 1A2. No more checkboxes are required, right? There's no co-op brokerage. It's not multiple representation. So you're essentially done with this document. Okay. Now that would be if you had your own listing. Not talking about if the seller is an SRP, and I'm not really going to get into that a whole lot today. Again, I don't want to raise confusion. Let's talk about just most commons. But again, okay. Then so we've got the section 3, which is the co-op brokerage completing section 3, right? Because you've got a co-op brokerage. So again, we've got 3A, we've got 3A1. Cooperating brokerage represents the interest of the buyer in this transaction. E is going to be the same as we've always had, right? For commission. So not a whole lot of changes from the most common scenarios, right? Now we're going to touch a little bit upon some of the multiple representation stuff. Again, there's going to be a lot of unique weirdness in here. Most of us do not love this form at this point in time. Don't feel it's very clear in some aspects. So we may see it amended, we may not, but of course, you know, here at EXP, we're always going to bring you the updates when and if they come around, okay? So let's just look at this briefly. First option is B, multiple representation. That's going to fall under the same thing as those multiple rep docs, right? Section is going to be only if both the listing and buyer representation documents are pre-TRESA, right? Which means a brokerage representation agreements, because we are now a designated representation model. And so we don't have, that's not part of our sort of new system, okay? Then the section C is going to be the section only if one or both buyer and seller are receiving limited services. I mean, we're a full service brokerage, so we want to steer clear from that as much as possible. Again, there might be scenarios in which case they pop up, but C is not going to be as common as next, which is D. Okay. And so the most common is going to be this section D, pretty much essentially once pre-TRESA documents are no longer valid, and or, you know, the documents have been done after December 1st. Agreements, sorry. This one is a little bit silly, the way that it is for now. Checkbox that says multiple representation and designated representation. Yes, you're going to use this. You're going to use number one, box number one in this D, right? If there is indeed multiple representation due to designated representatives representing the buyer and seller in the trade, or two buyers in two offers. Okay. Then there's a checkbox number 2, which is the unclear part to me. It is what it is. This is what we're going to use. First off, we're checking a box that says multiple representation, and now we're checking a box that says it's not multiple representation, okay? But this is what we're going to be using, is for now this checkbox number 2, where different designated representatives are representing the buyer and the seller. Yes, it says in the statement that there is no multiple representation. So that statement itself is clear. Weird bolded section, but that's what we're using. Okay, that's how we're dealing with those two scenarios. Okay, when you have listing represented by a designated representative at EXP, have a different designated representative representing the buyer at EXP. Okay. Again, I know we're going to have a ton of questions on this stuff. And if something weird pops up, unique, you're not sure, give us a call. I'm going to say it 100 times today. So let's kind of recap the process so far. How's everyone feeling? Do a little stretch. Brain still with me here?
A lot of talking. I know, Andrew, and you're doing a great job. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, let's keep moving on. So let's kind of recap the process. All right, so I want to take you through, let's pretend that got a consumer, all right, maybe, or you've got a listing, okay, or someone calls you up off of a lead or something like that. All right, at this point, they're a consumer. They're inquiring about something, whether it's your listing or something you've posted. All right, and at this point, you can continue to talk to them about public factual information. It's only when the judgment, opinion, service, skill, and advice comes into play, or they request an activity like going to see a property, that we need to start inserting the pauses process. And again, like we've talked about, the first pause is the Reco guide. Got a consumer, they want to start getting your opinions, or they want to go see a property. We'll deal with, let's say, going to be see a property. So the first question is, was the Reco guide shared, explained, and acknowledged? All three, not just one, all three: shared, explained, and acknowledged. The answer is no, then boom, we're done. We can't move any further other than public factual information. So the conversation can continue, it just can't go what they may want from you based on the questions they're asking, or if it's the blatant activity of going to see a property. So if the answer is no, we have to fulfill our Reco guide obligations before we can proceed. All right, pretty straightforward at this point, I think. Okay, so was the Reco guide shared and explained and acknowledged? Say yes. Okay. Now, if they're still undecided whether they're going to be an SRP or a consumer, talk about public factual information. Okay, can you show them the property if it's your listing? Sure can. Sorry, when I was talking earlier about seeing a property, I meant not your listing. Okay, I apologize. Talking about the activity. Your listing, and you've sent them the guide, they've understood it, explained it to them, and they acknowledged it. Okay, and they want to see your client's property. Sure, you can show it. Have to continue along with public factual information, but this is a service that is right. This is something that benefits your client. So yes, you can show them that property. Property that's not your listing, no, you can't, right? Okay. So was the guide shared, explained, and acknowledged? Yes. And we'll talk about the representation part in a bit, where we'll deal with SRP first, okay? Say that the consumer has declared that they are going to be a self-represented party, okay? That's what we're going to deal with next. What do we do there, right? And we've talked about this. So the consumer chooses to be an SRP, okay? If no, then that means they want to be represented, right? So we'll talk about that in the next slide. Consumer has chosen. We're going to deal with the yes aspect. Okay, so so if they've chosen to be an SRP, talking to them, and they've declared that. Okay, you already represent a client in the trade. Okay, no, you can't provide any assistance whatsoever. Right? Yes, you represent a client already in a trade. Right? So it's your listing, let's say. Then you would want to complete all those documents we talked about. Go SRP form, the AREA SRP form, working with the realtor. Once those are signed, okay, they refuse, we want to notate as best possible. You know, you've tried to get pictures and initials and whatnot. Okay, then you can provide assistance once you've completed those documents. Okay, and that's going to be that process. Okay. Still have everyone so far?
I think we're good.
All right, I'm just making sure. All right, because I know this is a lot of information. Okay, so let's go back now. We're rolling back. Okay, and the consumer has now decided that they want to be a client. Okay, what's the next question we have to ask ourselves as agents? You already represent a client in the trade. The answer is no. They're working with a realtor in the representation documents. Right? So if you don't already have a buyer who wants the same property, or it's not your listing, you're fine to go on, right? If the answer is yes, okay, again, here's the pause, right? We have to take that pause. What do we have to deal with? We have to deal with multiple representation. We have to obtain consent from both the buyer and the seller before we can proceed further, okay? What now? The next question, okay? The next question is going to be, did you obtain consent? Didn't. If one party disagrees, then I put here release or refer buyer to another agent. I mean, I guess you could the seller, but who's going to do that, right? You're going to refer the buyer, more than likely, you're referring the buyer to someone else, whether it's another EXP designated agent or a non-EXP, okay? The answer is yes, you did obtain consent. Then you're going to proceed with your working with a realtor, representation documents, and you're going to go through your transaction. Okay, again, when it comes up to the offer process, not a whole lot is changing. Getting to that point where we have multiple pauses in the process, because that's what Reco wants. That's what the legislation wants. It wants have these conversations with these people as we move them along through, not just bundling everything all up in one big fat old signing and then them going, then signing it all up. So that's how we're getting with those this whole flow chart here. We have to ask ourselves questions as we're going through. That's primarily going to be whether, how they declare themselves, if they do at all, right? You have someone else that you're representing already in the trade, whether you can provide assistance or not, or if multiple representation comes up, pause, obtain the consent. Once you get consent, boom, move forwards. Okay. Right. All right. So what else do we have here? So that pretty much covers sort of a general procedure with most common practices, right? You're going to run into someone who wants to have a conversation, start delving into needing your JASA, right? Then that's when you're putting a stopper on everything, and then you're proceeding as we've talked about. Okay. Now let's I think we're pretty much close to the end here, guys. I'm just adding into this the listing agreement, okay? Because a lot hasn't really changed with some of these initial documents when I'm talking about like buyer's representation, things like that. If you get into the limited services, of course, things are going to be right. However, with the listing agreement, we've got two big notable changes on this form. And the first one is going to stare you right in the face, slap you right in the face, and it's the designated representative. Okay. And that, of course, needs to be completed because that's the model that EXP has chosen. Right. And if you haven't been a part of some previous conversations, just to point out quickly, is that whole designated representative scenario, allows two separate EXP agents representing two different clients. They can come together on a deal and multiple representation does not come into effect, right? And that's the beauty about this model. You kind of want to limit the amount that multiple representation becomes an issue. Now, if Jane and Bob represent the seller, then Bob represents buyer, that's still multiple rep, right? It has to be 1 point of crossover in order for multiple rep to come into play. Okay. So hopefully this makes things a little bit clearer, right? When all this new legislation comes out, we tend to overthink, right? We're thinking to ourselves, well, what if this? What if that? What if the other thing? Sure, these are very important things to think about, but like I said with the shoelaces, right? You have to learn what the shoelaces are before you learn how to tie them. And we gave you the shoelaces last week. Today we learned about the most common way to tie your shoelaces. Most people tie their shoelaces the same way. Of course, there are unique ways to do that, and that's going to be all those other little bits and pieces. But, digesting this as most common is going to help you the best in order to get to that next stage. Okay. The other thing with the listing agreement I want to point out is that bubble. So there was that bubble only have to be initialed. Contract was 6 months or longer. Now this is a mandatory bubble because it's the seller acknowledging the length of the agreement is negotiable, but essentially the MLS may be subject to certain minimum requirements, right? Some boards minimum of 60 days on the market, things like that, right? And so though that's now a mandatory bubble when it comes to this contract. Right, and then pretty much after that, most things are all going to be the same. There is the listing, the Schedule A, right, of course, that you're going to have your list of services on. That's something we'll touch upon more in future sessions, but I really feel that this is a good digestible package to take in at this point, where we're just talking about sort of most common pathways that you're going to have in most of your transactions. So I want to kind of leave it with this, right? Would certainly have question answer session if you want to do. Catherine might have some things to say here, but other than that, I don't want to steer you into the land of confusion. Okay. We'll leave it with this, and then we'll, as every week goes by, we'll break out into more detailed things about maybe some unique scenarios. But for now, I think that's it for me. We have some questions. I hope this was a good session for you guys.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate your time and your efforts.
You are very welcome. Thank you.
It might
Yes,
take
there
them
will
a
be a
while to
recording.
go. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say it's a good idea to maybe review the slides a couple of times, so it just kind of sinks in a little bit, because I know it's a lot of information at once. But I think Andrew did an amazing job, even with the little arrows and boxes there for you. So that should really help kind of